What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today, we're working on a 2008 BMW E83 X3. Today, on the X3 behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace your rear suspension. In front of me, I have an OE Sachs kit, which includes new shocks and all the hardware to install them. And we have gone ahead and added 2 Lusher springs as well. As some of you may know, the E83 is notorious for going through rear springs. They tend to break over time, and this one is no exception to that rule. Now, typically, these are going to last you anywhere from 60 to 100,000 miles. It really depends on the kind of terrain your vehicle sees. The X3 behind us is at 175K, and as far as we know, on original suspension, so it is definitely due for a replacement. And on top of that, the rear coil springs are broken, so we're gonna go ahead and replace those too. A couple things to know: as these parts wear out over time, they can get a little bit noisy, the ride quality can degrade, and oftentimes you may hear some clunks and or feel them too, especially going over bumps. Another thing to note is while the springs may not look broken, it's important to inspect properly, as oftentimes they shear at the very end of the coils, and it's hard to tell whether or not they're broken until you see maybe like a rusted sharp end. So just keep that in mind. If you keep driving like that, you're gonna unevenly wear your rear tires, and then you're gonna be replacing tires in addition to suspension components. But before we go any further, let's take a look at some of the tools we're gonna need for this DIY. Aside from your regular socket sets and wrenches that you're going to be needing, which are listed over on my right, some of the specialty tools you'll need for this DIY to make your life a bit easier will be a trim removal tool, a small magnet, and a pass-through socket set, some of which are available on fcpeuro.com. Now we know what we're working with, let's go ahead and get started on this DIY. All right, gang, before we start removing our old shocks in the rear, we're gonna go ahead and assemble our new ones so they're ready to go right off the rip. So these are really straightforward. The Sachs kit includes everything you need to assemble them, so you don't need to disassemble the old ones. I highly recommend you replace these components anyways, so we're gonna go ahead and do so. To get started, you have your shock body. We've gone ahead and removed the locking nut. From there, we're gonna take our bump stop and our bellow. Now, if these are not destroyed on your vehicle and you want to go ahead and reuse them, as long as they are fully intact, go ahead. But we're going to go ahead and replace them with some fresh units. We're going to mate the bump stop to the bellow. These ones just take a little bit of force. You're going to kind of just squeeze them through the top, through one ridge, and that's kind of it. Then we'll take our bellow assembly and bump stop and feed it over the shaft of the shock and just make it level with this stepped part right up top here. Pretty straightforward. It doesn't matter if it goes past. As the car drives, it's going to level out, and there's only about an inch or so for it to travel anyways. We're going to take our large washer with the curvature going up and the cup portion going down. You'll see it kind of cups the top of the bump stop. You're going to go ahead and feed that over. Take your new shock mount, feed that over the top. Then we'll take our smaller washer with the curved part facing the shock mount and set it something like that. And then from there, we'll take our lock nut, feed that over the top, and then we can go ahead and get ready to tighten these down. Now, this is where that pass-through socket set that I mentioned at the beginning is going to come in handy, because it's designed specifically for suspension. So what you can do if you do not have this set at home, like I mentioned at the beginning, is use maybe some pliers or vice grips and a wrench. But since we have the right tools here today, we're going to go ahead and do it the right way. We have our counter hold tool, which grabs the flat notch on top of the shock body. That's super important. This is where that vice grip would be coming in handy if you did not have this. And then we have our pass-through socket. This is going to be a 16 mil socket. And then we're going to use a 1/2 inch ratchet. That's what's going to help hold the counter hold in place. Sometimes these can get a little tricky. You might need a second set of hands to kind of help you hold the shock body in place as you tighten everything down. If you have a vise, you can go ahead and do them on a vise as well. But we'll see what we can do with just ourselves here. And if not, we'll grab someone to give us a hand. The goal here is to hold the shaft from spinning and simply tightening down the lock nut, which is why these tools are so handy. But again, you could replicate this with a wrench and vice grips. The only issue you run into is you may shear off the top with vice grips, so that's why I kind of am hesitant at going that route. But you have limited tools, totally doable. All right, we'll just give it a light snug. Now we have our locking nut snugged up. At this point, we're gonna go ahead and give it the final torque of 24 Newton meters. So we'll grab our 16 millimeter socket and our torque wrench. Sometimes you may need a second set of hands. I think I'm gonna try to use a pry bar to just kind of hold the whole body here in between the studs of the shock mount, and then we'll go ahead and give it a torque. If not, I'll grab a buddy to help me out, and we'll torque it down properly. Beautiful. Now with our shocks ready to go, we can head over to the X3 and get ready to pull the old ones out. We'll also cover how to replace the coil springs. Let's get to it, my good people. All right, my good people, today we are gonna work on the passenger side of the X3. However, the steps are gonna be pretty much identical for both the driver's side and passenger side. The only thing that may change a little bit is the amount of hardware that holds the paneling inside the trunk of the X3, but otherwise, same process. So, 5 17 millimeter lug bolts to remove the wheel. If you're working at home on the ground, make sure you break these lug bolts free first with a breaker bar before you raise your X3 up. Then you can go ahead and remove the hardware. We have an impact, so we're just gonna zap them off. Now we have our wheel off, we have a better view of what we're gonna be replacing. We have our shock body right here. As you can see, the bellow still in one piece, totally reusable in this case. And the bump stop seems to be okay, but we have already gone ahead and replaced ours on our new shocks anyways. They're pretty inexpensive and they're good insurance. Over here, we have our coil spring. As you can see, it's nice and easy to access, which we'll get to once we undo the shock body. We'll give you a better, closer look in here in just a moment, but you can see how rotted these springs are. And while the pieces that broke off are no longer there, you can see the sharp edges on the end of the coil showing you how the coil already broke. Another thing you want to pay attention to are the shims on the coil. You have 2 different style shims, which I'll hold right here. You have one with an open end. This is going to sit up top. And then you have one with the sealed bottom. This one's going to sit on the bottom. So something like that. And we'll show you how to install those in just a moment. But with that, we're going to go ahead and set up our screw jack so we can support everything. And we'll work on disconnecting this lower shock body. All right, under the X3, this is where if you're working at home on the floor, you're gonna be using your floor jack. The goal here is to support the lower suspension assembly so that when you undo this bolt, 1, everything just doesn't drop, and 2, you're not putting a weird stress on the threads on the knuckle. Another thing, it's just funny, I just looked at, these shocks are from March 19th of 2008. This is a 2008 model, so that just goes to show these are original. Interestingly, they're not coated in anything, but there's no way they're still good. So we're gonna go ahead and remove this lower bolt first after we set up our screw jack. Again, floor jack at home for those of you following along. We're just taking off a little bit of load on the suspension. We're not trying to compress it or anything. Then we can take our 16 millimeter socket or wrench, whichever one you have handy, and remove this bolt. Okay. There is our shock body, this old bolt. I'm not even going to bother fighting it to get it out of here since we're replacing the whole assembly. You should replace these anyways. If you're not, make sure to apply a little bit of blue Loctite to the threads just so that they can stay in there securely. Now with that situated, I'm going to remove this screw jack and we're going to head back up front and we'll work on removing the broken coil springs. All right, now that we have the shock undone, we can go ahead and work on removing this coil spring. If you're not replacing your coil spring, go ahead and skip forward, but please don't. Just hang out with me for a little bit. I could use the company. We're gonna grab our giant pry bar and we're gonna go ahead and just get it underneath that lower control arm. We're gonna use that as our prime point and we're simply gonna pry down and just work on pulling this out. Sometimes it helps to have a second set of hands while you pry, someone else can pull out the spring. So I might have my good friend Mark come in here for the who knows what time today and just pull the coil spring out as I pry. Thank you, sir. Before we pull anything off, here's a very clear view of that broken coil down at the bottom. Here's the top portion of the coil with the top spring shim. Now, these are probably reusable. They're not completely destroyed, but they are left with the impression of the old coil spring. So we're gonna replace them anyways. But what I'm gonna do is match up the top of this coil spring with my new one, just so I know which end goes where. We'll pull this out. There's a lot of wet debris grime in there that I'll wipe up. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and install our new coil spring. A couple things to note. There are two different ends to the coil spring, just as there are two different shims. The smaller or tinier coil is gonna be for the top. It's gonna take the smaller opening shim, if you will, if that makes sense. This is a smaller opening than the one at the bottom. And at the bottom of the coil spring, your opening is gonna be a bit bigger. It's gonna take the cone-shaped spring shim, and then they're gonna look something like this. And they can really go in any direction. It's really whatever's easier for you. There's no set point for the coil itself, but we're gonna go ahead and install the top first and then wiggle our bottom portion in, and that should be it. So a little bit of wrestling perhaps. If you run into a difficult time doing this, you can remove the sway bar end link so you can have a little bit more of a droop, which you may see us do if we cannot get this full coil spring in. So let's get to it. I'm gonna have my friend Mark help me put the new spring in while I pry down the lower control arm. All right, my good people, at this point we have our spring in. You may have heard us struggle with it a bit. It is truly a two-person job. Even BMW TIS recommends 2 people to do this. And the procedure for it is simply to pry the lower control arm down, pull the old spring out, get your new one in, and then release. So what I did here with the help of Mark is I stood on the brake disc assembly here while he went ahead and pulled out the old spring and then placed in the new one. So that was the easiest way for us to do it. You may be able to get it with a large pry bar and then having the second person pulling the spring up, but just wanted to show you how we did it here in the shop. Now that our spring is all situated, we can hop into the back trunk section of the X3 so we can access the 3 13mm bolts that hold the top of our shock mount in place. So with that, catch you in the trunk. All right, in the trunk, my good people, we're gonna start disassembling the passenger side. However, the driver's is gonna be the same. We're gonna start by removing this access panel first. It has a release button that you push, and it ejects the panel. From there, we're gonna wanna remove this, if you will, D-pillar sill, starting with removing the Phillips head screw, which is located right here. This is where if you have your trunk cover latches into. So we'll go ahead and remove that Phillips. And if you have it, a magnet tool will be super handy back here in the trunk area. Moving forward, we have one more Phillips screw located under here. With those 2 removed, we should be able to remove this panel now. Before I go ahead and pry it out, following the top of the trim here, I'm gonna use a trim removal tool. There's 2 plastic clips that clip into the rest of the vehicle here. Just gonna go ahead and pop those open. And now that we have that popped up, we can lift it up. And then we have one electrical connector to undo for our interior lighting. Simply just, you can pop it out as well. But to unclip it, you simply just pull back and you undo it. Go ahead and pop this back in. All right, now that we have that removed, we have another Phillips head screw, which is located underneath this little bracket right here. You can see the half moon in it for your screwdriver. We'll go ahead and pull that one out next. This is why I will use my magnet tool to fish it out. Following this trim down, we'll see another Phillips screw right here. We'll go ahead and remove that as well. Okay, that should free up most of this side. Now we're gonna go ahead and move over to the front half of the seat. So you obviously wanna fold down your seats. Give me 1 sec. Using our trim removal tool, we're gonna pop this top cap off. You can usually slide the trim removal tool up here up front. Sometimes you don't need this if it's been off before, but they're not held in very tightly. Just nice and gentle. And go ahead and slide it down the seat belt. Just let it hang up to the side. Next, we're gonna remove this end cushion portion of the rear bench. Simply grab from the top, pull towards you, and then pull up and out. We'll go ahead and set that to the side. Now we have this cushion removed. We have access to one more Phillips head screw right here, which we'll go ahead and remove. From there, we can remove this small cover just to make our lives a little bit easier when we pull this trim down. The top of this trim, the bottom has 2 tabs that just key into the carpet here. And then the top two tabs flex down so you can kind of press them in while you put it on, and then they'll come back up and catch the carpeting here. So kind of cool, only goes in one way. Moving forward, we have a rivet that we want to remove. I'm gonna use my trim removal tool to just pop it out. All right, now we need to work on a couple T25s and a 10 mil that's back here. So let's get a little bit more cozy with it, and we'll show you how to pull those out. We have one 10 millimeter nut down here that we're gonna want to remove. With the nut undone, we'll just grab our magnet tool and fish it out. All right, now we have two T25s that we want to undo. Those are a little bit tucked under here, but once you see them, you can't miss them. All right. Now we have those two T25s removed, we can go ahead and just wedge this cover up, just like so. You can remove this. Just kind of wiggle it out of here, just like that. Now we have one more Phillips head screw, which is hidden right here. And now we can go ahead and pull this carpet forward, just being mindful that we still have an electrical plug on the passenger side here. So there's going to be some wiring behind that. All right. Now we're just going to go ahead and unplug our cigarette lighter outlet. Simply pull back. And that gives us a little bit more flexibility here. Now we can see the two 13s in the back. We have one more hidden up front there. I'm going to grab the electric ratchet just to zap them out. Normally there should be a rubber cap over this that kind of just keeps the elements out or any weather and moisture. However, these are missing, so we'll go ahead and install them that come with the new kit. Be mindful when you zap these three out, if no one's down there to grab it, the shock will just fall out. We're pretty much on the ground, so we're not too worried about hurting anybody or anything, but if you do have a second set of hands, have them catch the shock for you while they're down there. And now with that, we can go ahead and feed our new shock in. Now my friend Gareth has gone ahead and fed the shock body into the wheel well for us. We can go ahead and just get a couple of these nuts started by hand. With those three started, we can go ahead and just snug them up with the electric ratchet, and then we'll give them a final torque down. All right, now we'll grab the torque wrench and torque them down to 24 Newton meters. There's three. Now we have all three 13 millimeter nuts torqued down. We can go ahead and add our insulation cap now. So let's go ahead and do that. We can go ahead and reconnect our cigarette lighter connector. Really only goes on one way. You can see it's kind of like a T. So you want to go ahead and plug that back in. And now we can work on feeding our cover back on into place. So for that, we're going to go ahead and lift this trim piece one more time. Our goal is to get this tab underneath it. These all have a little bit of flex in them. Don't worry about breaking them. You're not going to break them. That can go like that. We're also going to tuck this black piece in place right now while we have everything nice and loose. And now we can go ahead and reinstall the Phillips head screw that's tucked underneath here, so we can lower this piece down one more time. It's important to know all the covered Phillips have a washer on them. The non-washer ones are usually going to be the ones on your end, one for the D pillar trim or C pillar, and one that goes behind the seat cushion. Okay, that one can snug up. We can tuck this trim piece back into place. Just be mindful of your drain hose here. You don't want to damage that as you're putting this back into its home. Wrestle that sucker back into place. We're going to continue on resecuring this with the two T25s and then the 10 mil that's hidden back there. Start both of them by hand, that way you know that the pieces align properly, and then you can snug them down and tighten them up. We're just going to hand snug these. If you wanted to torque them, no more than 8 to 10 Newton meters. They're just holding some plastic in place for the rear trunk cover. And snug. For the 10 mil, I'm going to fish it in with the magnet. Just get it on the stud, slide the magnet off of it, and then I can get my 10 mil socket down there. If you don't have a magnet, you can tape the socket and the nut together. use a little bit of electrical tape on the socket, just enough so it just grabs the nut, and then you can pull it off with the socket and you remove it. Now we can go ahead and reinstall our push rivet. While I have it here, we can go ahead and install this trim piece. There we go. I'm just gonna use this trim tool to push these tabs in. There we go. That's secure. Moving over here, we have one more Phillips screw. Now we can install this portion of our cushion. You can see it has an alignment tab and another hooking tab that kind of help guide it into place. Really only goes on one way. Boom. This top piece just clips in. Line it up nicely. It has one tab up here that clips in here. That's one of the more important ones along with the other ones, but that's going to help you guide it into place. Beautiful. Now with that, let's head out back and finish up this install. Back in the rear section of the trunk, we're going to continue reinstalling our Phillips head screws. And again, we're working on the passenger side, but the driver's side is going to be pretty much identical with the exception of the cigarette lighter cable. Moving up, we have this sneaky one that's hidden under there. All right. Now from there, we're going to go ahead and grab our D or C pillar. What is it? Leave it in the comments and let me know, because I keep calling it both things. We're going to grab our last trunk pillar here and get that installed before we add the last two Phillips. Make sure to plug in your light once more if you disconnected it. Then we're going to key in this trim down below here first. We'll worry about the weather stripping after. We can tuck that and fold that over at the end. But for now, we'll tuck that in there like that. We want to line up the two clips to go into the two rubber grommets in here. Just kind of line that all up. There we go. We can take your finger, a trim tool, a flathead screwdriver, anything that you have to just run the weather stripping back over this lip. There we go. And now we can secure our last Phillips with the large washer in there. That holds both of those panels together. And do our small Phillips in there. And then to button up this trunk area, we have our last panel, which was the first one we removed. And with this, we can head back underneath the X3 and hook up our shock to the knuckle. So let's do that now. All right, my good people, we are back under the X3. We're going to finalize this DIY install. If you're following along at home, this is where you want to pull out the floor jack so you can raise the whole knuckle assembly to mate with the rear shock. We are on the lift, so we're going to use a screw jack. So I'm going to raise these till they're about even. You want to make sure the flat spacer is facing towards the inside of the vehicle so that the bushing side is mated to the spindle. Now we'll just go ahead and raise, get them as close as possible, and then we'll start our new 18mm bolt. If you're not replacing your bolt, clean up the threads really, really well. And then I recommend you use a little bit of Loctite on there as well, as the factory bolt uses Loctite. These have been known to just come loose. Ask me how I know. If you replace your springs, it's normal to hear them kind of seat into place, especially if you replace the shims. Also might be a little bit tough if you have brand new springs in there as they're compressing for the first time ever, but again, totally normal. All right, we are very close. That looks pretty good. I'm gonna see if I can get that bolt started by hand. All right, we'll grab our 18. I'm using a 1/2" drive wrench or 1/2" drive ratchet. A bit overkill for the install. Definitely helpful for the removal, but we have it here. We'll go ahead and use it. This should be going in nice and easy. If you're having a hard time with it, check your threads, clean the threads on the bolts, maybe check the alignment of the shock and the knuckle. You don't want to cross thread this. All right, now that that's snug, we'll give it a final torque of 100 Newton meters. We'll give it the old paint mark. And now we can go ahead and remove the screw jack, get a little bit more eye level with the vehicle, and get our wheel back on. All right, let's drop her down. I have my torque wrench set to 90 foot-pounds or 122 Newton meters. We're gonna go ahead and snug them down in a cross pattern Always recommend that whenever you're tightening wheel lugs or lug nuts, studs, whatever the case may be. Then we'll do one final round, check them all. And boom, there we have it, my good people. Another DIY in the books. Overall, a straightforward job on the X3s, but definitely a two-person job. So call your best friend over, grab some drinks, grab some snacks, and get to wrenching. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, or there's a specific job you want to see us do on the E83 platform, leave them in the comment box below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.